On July 23, 2007, news of an unspeakable tragedy spread across the town of Cheshire, Connecticut. The Petit family was an average American household. William Petit Jr. was an endocrinologist, and Jennifer Hawk Petit was a pediatric nurse. They had two daughters, 17-year-old Haley and 11-year-old Michaela. Haley had recently graduated high school and planned to study medicine at Dartmouth in the fall. Michaela enjoyed gardening and cooking. The evening of Sunday, July 22, 2007, 48-year-old Jennifer and her 11-year-old daughter, Michaela Petit, went to a local Stop and Shop grocery store in Cheshire, Connecticut. They picked up food for a family dinner Michaela planned to prepare. During their trip to the grocery store, 26-year-old Joshua Komazarjevsky noticed them and took interest, then followed them home. He had a fascination with the Petits' money, and, as prosecutors would later argue, a dark interest in young Michaela. So who was Joshua? Joshua Komazarjevsky was adopted as a baby and homeschooled as a child. He was extremely intelligent, but as he got older, he was in and out of jail regularly on burglary charges. His hope was that he would straighten his life out and become an architect. In 2002, Joshua's daughter was born. In the spring of 2007, he gained full custody of her, as his ex-girlfriend was in rehab for drug addiction. Once he gained custody, the girl went to live with Joshua's parents. In 2007, he began dating Caroline Mezel, who was only 18 at the time. Their relationship became serious quickly and the two began to contemplate marriage. However, Caroline's father did not approve of the relationship because of Joshua's reputation as a career criminal. He also considered Komazarjevsky to be a pedophile, convinced that he was only interested in his daughter because she looked young for her age. Let's get back to the story. So he followed the two of them home. According to a statement Joshua later made, he thought the Petit had a very nice house and very nice car and thought it would be nice to be there someday. Komazarjevsky later claimed he only planned to rob the family as they slept during the early hours of July 23. For the horrors that were to follow, Joshua wasn't working alone. He brought an accomplice, 44-year-old Stephen Hayes, who, though presenting as a man at the time, has since come out as a transgender woman. Linda Hayes. Let's know more about Stephen. His parents divorced when he was a child and he lived with his mother and two brothers, Matthew and Brian. According to Matthew, Steve was manipulative from a young age. Matthew claimed that he was also violent, once taunting him by pressing a revolver against Matthew's head. Stephen was controlling and had a way of passing the blame for his bad behavior onto others. He would often claim he was suffering from psychological problems, but his family were skeptical. Steve is not sick, Matthew claimed, he is cunning and calculating. What was Stephen and Joshua's criminal history? They met in 2006, when they shared a room in a halfway house in Hartford, Connecticut in between prison sentences. By the age of 26, Joshua had been arrested for 18 home invasions and struggled with crystal meth addiction. Stephen was a recovering crack addict and seasoned burglar who mainly broke into cars during the day, stealing high-value items once the owner had parked and left. The two were both serving sentences for burglary when they were paroled in April of 2007. Joshua had originally been charged with 12 counts of burglary and sentenced to 9 years in prison in December 2002, but was paroled after serving a total of close to 5 years. Both men stayed in a halfway house briefly until they were released the following month. Steve moved in with his mother in Winsted, Connecticut, and Joshua returned home to Cheshire. There was some talk between the two, mainly on the part of Joshua, about the idea of starting a contracting business together, but nothing ever became of it. Stephen's situation was not ideal. His younger brother was sleeping on the floor at their mother's house, and she was threatening to kick Steve out and told him he was no longer allowed to use her car. Let's get back to main story. The night of the 22nd, around 7:45 p.m. Steve texted Joshua, writing, "I'm chomping at the bit to get started. Need a margarita soon. He waited an hour, but received no reply. At 8:45, Stephen wrote to Joshua again. We still on? Joshua, yes. Stephen, soon? Joshua, I'm putting the kid to bed, hold your horses. Stephen, dude, the horses want to get loose. LOL. According to Stephen's confession, he and Joshua had planned to rob the Petit house under the cover of darkness, leaving the family bound but otherwise unharmed. At around 11 p.m., the Petit girls headed to bed after watching TV. Will Petit remained asleep on the couch in the sunroom. Michaela got into bed with Jennifer and Haley went to her room. Will woke up at one point, but decided to stay sleeping on the couch that night, not wanting to wake Jennifer. Having discussed the plan with Joshua, Stephen was under the impression that the two of them would burglarize the house, take the family out to the car where they would be tied up, and then burn the house down to destroy any evidence left behind. There was no indication to Stephen that anyone would get hurt. Around 3 a.m. on July 23, Stephen and Joshua broke into the Petit family home, armed with a gun and a baseball bat they found lying in a neighbor's yard. When they found Will sleeping on the couch in the sunroom, Joshua hit him 4 or 5 times over the head with a baseball bat. Then told Will not to panic and they only wanted money. He asked where the safe was in the house. Will replied that there was no safe. Steve and Joshua tied his wrists and ankles with plastic zip ties and rope together, leaving him on the couch bound and bleeding. Will remembers one perpetrator telling the other, if he moves, put 2 bullets in him. The two men then made their way upstairs, where they found Jennifer in her bed with Michaela. They tied Jennifer's wrists and ankles to the bedposts and put a pillowcase over her head. They then dragged Michaela into her own bedroom and did the same to her as they did to Jennifer, then the same again to Haley in her room. As they had told Will, they reassured Jennifer and the girls that they weren't going to hurt them and were only wanted money. After restraining the victims, Joshua and Stephen ransacked the house for cash. Making their way downstairs again, they made a beeline for Will, who still lay on the couch bleeding from his head wound. They cut the restraints from his ankles and forced him down to the basement at gunpoint. Once in the basement, Will was tied to a pole, his ankles bound, and he was covered with blankets. Feeling woozy from the blood loss, Will drifted in and out of consciousness. Stephen and Joshua continued ransacking the house for money but were not satisfied with what they found. They then found bank statements which showed the Petit had around £30,000 in their Bank of America account. Here the plan changed. They decided that when the bank opened in the morning at 9 a.m., one of them would take Jennifer and force her to withdraw $15,000 from her account. Before that, Hayes drove to a gas station with 2 plastic canisters he had found at the Petit home. Once there, he filled the canisters with $10 worth of gas. He then drove back to the Petit family home, dropped off the gas canisters and then went back out again, this time with Jennifer to the bank. Hayes told her to go into the bank and withdraw $15,000 from her account. She complied. Jennifer approached the bank teller, leaned in and passed a note over the counter. The teller glanced at the note and without hesitating, gave the note to the bank manager, who ran into her office. Jennifer then left the bank, making her way back to the car where Stephen was waiting. She got in and they drove back to the house. As Jennifer was leaving the bank manager called 911 at approximately 9:21 a.m. and informed the dispatcher of the situation. Jennifer had also told the bank teller that the men holding she and her family hostage were being nice and only wanted money. Shortly after the call was made, police were dispatched to the address in unmarked vehicles and they proceeded to set up a perimeter around the home. They then hid behind trees not far from the house. There is substantial controversy surrounding the police action from this point. As they went about setting up the perimeter, Joshua was inside the home raping Michaela as she lay tied to her bed. Which he later confessed to when interrogated. Evidence that Joshua raped Michaela came from her autopsy. He claimed that he believed Michaela was 14 or 16. Forensic testing results showed that there was bleach on Michaela's clothes, indicating that Joshua may have tried to eliminate DNA evidence from the assault. He then proceeded to take explicit pictures of her on his cell phone. He went downstairs to find Stephen and Jennifer had returned. Joshua showed Hayes the pictures he had taken of Michaela, taunting him to do the same to Jennifer. Stephen pushed Jennifer down onto the living room floor and begins raping her. Joshua left the room, and on his return, he informed Stephen that Will had escaped. At this point, Stephen loses it completely. He looks out the window to see an unmarked police car. At that, he puts his hands around Jennifer's neck and strangles her to death. Will was able to hear his wife's assault upstairs. He yelled up and heard one of the invaders say, "Don't worry. It's all gonna be over in a couple of minutes." Will then managed to escape through the bulkhead of the basement. He later testified in court that he felt a jolt of adrenaline and a need to escape after being told this. "I thought, it's now or never, because in my mind at that moment, I thought they were going to shoot all of us." A horribly beaten Will stumbled across his yard to his neighbor's driveway, bleeding heavily and hardly able to speak. His neighbor came out of his house, and on seeing Will initially, he didn't recognize him because he was almost completely covered in blood. The neighbor calls 911. A policeman appeared, looking down at Will, holding a rifle. Will can barely speak, but tries desperately to shout that the girls are still in the house. But it's too late. Once Stephen kills Jennifer, he pours gasoline over her body. He covers as much of the home as he can with gasoline, including over Haley and Michaela, who are still tied to their beds with pillowcases over their heads. Hayes then set the fire, and the two attempted to flee in the Petit family's car, but they barely make it down the driveway when they crashed into a police barrier at the end of the drive. They are detained immediately. By the time firefighters arrived at the scene, flames had engulfed the top floor of the house. 3 people are dead in the home, Jennifer strangled in the living room. Haley and Michaela both died of smoke inhalation. Haley managed to escape her restraints and run out of her bedroom and into the hallway, where she collapsed and died. Her body was found at the top of the staircase. 3rd and 4th degree burns on her feet indicate that she got very close to the fire around the time she died. The medical examiner who performed an autopsy on her could not determine if the burns occurred before or after her death. Michaela's body was found in her bedroom. She was still in her bed, her hands tied to it and her lower body hanging off it. Like with her older sister, Michaela's burns may have occurred while she was still alive. Stephen described to detectives what had happened just several hours after he and Joshua were detained. Detectives testified that Stephen smelled of gasoline throughout his interrogation. He described how he had taken Jennifer to the bank, raped and strangled her, and then doused her body and Haley and Michaela in gasoline. Reports vary as to who lit the match. Both men pin this on one another. Joshua also blamed William Petit for the murders. In Joshua's diary, which was later entered into evidence, he called William a coward and claimed that he could have saved his family if he wanted to. Stephen told the detectives that after Joshua had showed him the pictures he had taken of Michaela and seeing the police car outside the house, he just snapped and lost control. He said that he did not blame Joshua for what happened, however, he only had himself to blame. He insisted that regardless of all that had happened, all he wanted out of that night was money. Joshua admitted to following Jennifer and Michaela in the grocery store the previous day and then following them home. He said the reason he targeted them was because they looked wealthy and had a nice car. He admitted to bludgeoning Bill with the baseball bat and to raping and taking explicit pictures of Michaela. But when it came to burning the house down with Jennifer and the girls still inside, he told detectives that that was all Stephen. He told them that he questioned Stephen, saying to him, "You can't seriously be contemplating burning these 2 girls alive?" Joshua did not report doing anything to stop him, however. Originally, they agreed to a plea bargain which would give them life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the defense presented the deal to the prosecution, however, They did not agree that either man should have this option. Instead, they would pursue the death penalty in both cases. In Connecticut, this meant both men would have to have a jury trial. Stephen's trial began on October 18, 2010. The jury was composed of 7 women and 5 men. Stephen's attorneys argued that Joshua was the mastermind behind the home invasion and that he was responsible for escalating the violent nature of the crime at every critical point. Prosecutors argued that both perpetrators shared responsibility. Stephen's attorney, Thomas Ullman, told the jury that being given a life sentence would be the worst punishment for him, worse than being sentenced to death, because he was tortured every day by his actions. The jury ultimately came to the verdict that Hayes should be executed. The jury recommended a death sentence on each of the 6 capital felony counts for which Stephen was convicted. In the sentencing phase, the jury had deliberated for about 17 hours, over the course of 4 days before reaching a decision. During a press conference after the verdict, Will Petit stated, "We all know that God will be the final arbiter, and I think the defendant faces far more serious punishments from the Lord than Stephen can ever face from mankind." He also spoke about his family, saying, "Michaela was an 11-year-old little girl tortured and killed in her own bedroom, surrounded by stuffed animals. Haley had a great future. She was a strong and courageous person, and Jennifer helped so many kids." In December 2010, Stephen apologized to the Petit family for the pain he had caused. He said, "Death for me will be a welcome relief, and I hope it will bring some peace and comfort to those who I have hurt so much." The judge gave Stephen an official execution date of May 27, 2011. He said the date was a formality, because if he appealed his case, his execution could be delayed for decades. His death sentence became a life sentence in August 2015 when the state abolished capital punishment. Joshua's attorneys offered for him to plead guilty in exchange for a life sentence, but prosecutors took the case to trial in order to give him the death penalty. His trial began on October 13, 2011. During his hearing, Joshua stood by what he had said in his confession, that he had never planned on killing anyone that night. He added, "I will never find peace within. My life will be a continuation of the hurt I caused. The clock is now ticking and I owe a debt I cannot repay. Millions have judged me guilty of capital offenses I did not commit. I did not intend for those women to die. They were never supposed to lose their lives. I don't need 12 people to tell me what I'm guilty or not guilty of. None of them were there that morning. I know my responsibilities. I will bear them as I should. What I cannot do is claim responsibility for the actions of another." He spoke about how the trial affected him, saying that he had become quite comfortable in the face of hatred and bigotry. He also said that forgiveness was not his to have, and that he needed to forgive his worst enemy, himself. The jury came to the verdict that Joshua should also be executed. He said that the jury who recommended the death penalty for him believed me so worthless even my very existence is deemed intolerable. The judge set July 20, 2012, as Joshua's execution date. As with Stephen, Komazarjevsky's death sentence was turned into a life sentence in August 2015. William Petit condemned the Connecticut Supreme Court's decision to abolish the death penalty, saying he believed the court had overstepped its powers and urging it to give greater consideration to the emotional impact, particularly on victims and their loved ones, that death penalty cases generate. Jennifer Petty's sister Cindy Hochran told NBC News that she was disheartened by the court's ruling. On August 5, 2012, Will Petit married Christine Palouf and moved to Farmington, Connecticut. He met her when she was volunteering with the Petit Family Foundation. HBO broadcast a documentary by filmmaker David Heilbrenner called The Cheshire Murders about the murders on July 22, 2013. On August 1, 2013, Will Petit told station WFSB that he and Palouf were expecting a child together. The baby, who was revealed to be a boy and named William Petit III, was born on November 28, 2013. Well, this was the story that happened to the Petit family. I hope Jennifer and Michaela and Haley's soul rests in peace. If you enjoy, please subscribe to the channel.